My name is Grace Hartwell, and I was 18 the night my father tore my future in half at the dinner table. The acceptance letter I'd waited 4 years for sat between the mashed potatoes and the gravy boat, and by the end of that meal, it was two ragged pieces beside my plate. My father said no daughter of his wasted money on school, and my mother looked at her lap, and my whole family let it happen. But there was one thing about that house my father didn't know, one thing my grandmother had been holding quietly all along. What she slid across that table 2 weeks later is the reason I'm telling you this. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet women win the loudest battles without ever raising their voices. If a family that undervalued you ever underestimated exactly what you were capable of, this one is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. We lived in the house my grandfather built, a tall white farmhouse at the end of Miller Road, and everything about it had a place. The coats hung left to right by height. The good plates came down twice a year. And the dinner table sat 8, though we were only 5, with my father at the head where the light was best. That was the rule nobody wrote down. My father sat at the head, my mother to his right, my little brother Cole across from her, and me, wherever there was room to be useful. I was the one who carried the dishes in and carried them out. I refilled the water before anyone asked. When my parents started to argue, I was the one who found a small joke to set down between them like a plate. I had been doing it so long I didn't know I was doing it. And at the far end of the table in the chair by the window sat my grandmother, Margaret Hartwell. Meg, everyone called her. 78 years old, spine straight as a fence post. She ate slowly. She said little. My father talked over her the way you talk over a radio left on in another room. I used to wonder, in a quiet corner of my mind, why she chose that seat. The far end, the cold end, the end farthest from the head of the table. I thought she was just old and liked the window. It would be years before I understood that my grandmother had never once needed to sit at the head of a table to own the whole room. She was simply waiting. I didn't know for what. Not yet. The letter came on a Tuesday in April, and I read it 4 times standing at the mailbox before I let myself believe it. Full engineering scholarship. A real university, 300 miles away, with a robotics lab I had read about until the pages went soft. I had done all of it alone. I filled out the applications at the library after school because our home computer was for my father's work and my brother's games. I wrote the essays in a notebook first, then typed them in 40-minute chunks before the library closed. I asked my physics teacher for a recommendation and hid the whole thing like a small animal I was afraid someone would step on. Nobody in my family knew I had applied, and standing at that mailbox, holding the paper that said I had won, the first thing I felt wasn't pride. It was hope. A stupid, tender hope that this, finally, would be the thing that made my father proud of me. I pictured it so clearly. I would set the letter down at dinner, casual, and he would read it, and something would change in his face. He would see that the quiet daughter who carried the dishes had built something out of nothing. I had spent 18 years trying to be useful enough, small enough, good enough to earn that look, and I thought a piece of paper could finally buy it. I folded the letter into my jacket pocket and walked home past the fields, rehearsing how I would say it. Light. Easy. Like it was no big deal. I had no idea I was carrying the last hopeful version of myself down that road. I waited until we were all seated and the food was passed. My mother had made pot roast, my father's favorite, which I told myself was a good sign, the way you read signs when you're desperate for one. Cole was talking about a truck he wanted. My grandmother was cutting her carrots into small even squares, and I reached into my jacket, took out the letter, and set it on the table beside my father's plate like it was nothing. "I got some news," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I applied to state. For engineering. My father kept chewing. He didn't look up. "They gave me a full scholarship," I said. "It covers everything. Tuition, housing. I wouldn't cost you a dime." That last part I had practiced the most, because I knew where the fight would be. My mother's fork paused in the air. Cole looked between us, sensing weather. My father set down his own fork, slow, and finally picked up the letter. He read it. I watched his eyes move across the lines, and for one breath, I let myself believe I saw it. That flicker, that change in his face I had chased my whole life. Then his jaw set. He turned the letter over like he was checking it for a trick. Engineering, he said, flat, like the word tasted wrong. 300 miles away. It's a full ride, Dad, I said. I earned it. My grandmother, at the far end of the table, had gone very still. She was not cutting her carrots anymore. My mother said, "Roy." Soft. A warning or a plea, I couldn't tell which. My father held the letter up between two fingers, and I felt the whole room tip toward whatever he was about to do. He was not smiling. He was doing the math a certain kind of man does when a daughter forgets her place. "No daughter of mine wastes money on school," my father said, and he tore the letter in half. He did it slowly, deliberately, the way you tear something to make sure everyone sees you do it. The paper made a small, ordinary sound, the sound of a receipt or a grocery list, nothing that should have been able to end a life. He set the two halves down next to the potatoes and picked his fork back up. "You'll stay here," he said. "Learn to run a house. Find a decent man. That's worth more than some degree you'll never use." My mother looked at her plate. Cole looked at his. Nobody moved. The kitchen clock kept going, loud in a way it had never been before. I sat there with my hands in my lap and felt something inside my chest go cold and quiet, the way a house goes quiet when the power cuts out. I had built that scholarship with my own two hands, at a library table, in 40-minute pieces, and he had ended it, between bites of pot roast. And here is the part I am not proud of, the part I have thought about 1,000 times since. I did not shout. I did not stand up. I did not sweep the plates onto the floor the way something ancient in me wanted to. At the far end of the table, my grandmother set down her fork. She did not say a word, but she set it down carefully, precisely in the exact center of her plate, and she folded her hands, and she looked at my father with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger. Something older and steadier than anger. Something that had been waiting a very long time. My father didn't notice. He was buttering a roll. And in the silence, I heard my own voice, small and terrible, doing the only thing it knew how to do. "I'm sorry," I said. That was what I said. Not "I earned this." Not "you had no right." Not 18 years of everything I'd swallowed. I said I was sorry. And then I reached across the table and gathered the two halves of my own acceptance letter, and I apologized for ruining dinner. I remember my hands shaking as I lined the torn edges up, as if I could press them back together right there beside the gravy. "It's fine," I said, to no one. "Sorry, let's just eat." And my father nodded, satisfied, because that was the daughter he had raised. The one who carried the dishes and smoothed the silences and said sorry for taking up room. My mother's shoulders came down an inch, relieved the storm had passed. Cole went back to his truck, and I hated myself in that moment more than I hated my father, because I understood, sitting there with the pieces of my future in my hands, that I had spent my whole life doing this exact thing. Making myself smaller so that the people who undervalued me would stay comfortable, apologizing for the space I took, believing, underneath it all, that if I was just good enough, and quiet enough, and useful enough, one day they would finally see me and be glad. I had been knocking on that door since I was old enough to reach the handle. And the terrible thing was, I still believed it might open. I still believed a torn letter could be taped, a mind could be changed, a father could be won. I gathered my ruined future, said sorry one more time for good measure, and carried the dishes to the sink, because that was my job. My grandmother watched me the whole way. I felt her eyes on my back like a hand. Upstairs, in my room, I taped the letter back together. I did it slowly, at my desk, under the lamp, matching the torn fibers like a person setting a broken bone. When it was whole again, more or less, I read it. and near the bottom I found the line I had glossed over in my joy at the mailbox. Enrollment and scholarship confirmation due by May the 1st. A deposit to hold my place. I checked the calendar taped to my wall. It was the 20th of April. 10 days. 10 days to confirm a thing my father had just forbidden, using money I did not have, from a family that had just told me my future was worth less than a decent marriage. I sat with that number for a long time. 10 days. I did the math the way I did everything, carefully, on paper. The deposit was a few $100s. I had a little saved from babysitting the Corbin kids, not enough. The scholarship covered tuition and housing, but not the deposit that held the seat, and not the bus ticket, and not the deposit on a dorm key. The whole enormous gift hinged on a small pile of dollars I couldn't reach. I taped the calendar page so I would see it every morning. 10 days. And then I made myself a promise, sitting there under the lamp with the mended letter in front of me. I did not know yet how I would do it, but I was not going to let a man who had never built anything tear apart the one thing I had. I turned off the light. Down the hall, under my grandmother's door, another light was still burning. I didn't think anything of it then. I should have. The next morning, I tried the direct way, because I still believed in it. I found my father in the kitchen with his coffee and I said, calm as I could, "Dad, I've thought about it. Let me handle the whole thing myself. I'll get a job. I won't ask you for anything. You won't have to pay a cent, and I'll still come home for holidays." I had rehearsed it to sound reasonable, small, unthreatening. He didn't even set down his coffee. "School doesn't teach a girl to cook a pot roast," he said, and he almost smiled, like it was a joke we shared. "You want to throw 4 years away chasing some boy's club degree? That's a fantasy, not a plan." My mother was at the stove. I looked at her, the last door I had left, and I said, "Mom," just her name, a whole plea in one word, and she turned back to the eggs and said, "Your father knows what's best, Grace. He's only trying to keep you from getting hurt." That was the moment the first wall came down. Not my father. I had expected him. My mother. The one who was supposed to know what it cost to be a girl in this family and had decided to guard the gate anyway. I nodded, because nodding was what I did. And my father, sensing the ground was his, delivered the line that would sit in my chest for the next 2 weeks. "And Grace," he said, tapping the table once, "you bring up that school one more time, you can find your own roof to sleep under." He said it lightly. That was the worst part. He said it the way you'd mention rain. Then he finished his coffee and left for the shop, and I stood in the kitchen with nowhere left to knock. I want you to know I didn't just sit there and take it. That afternoon, I walked into town and put in applications everywhere that would have me. The diner, the hardware store, the grocery on Route 9. I asked Mr. Pell at the hardware store straight out if he could pay me weekly, in cash, starting now, and how many hours he could give a girl still finishing high school. I sat at the library and did the real math, the ugly math, on a legal pad. Deposit by May 1st. Full-time work at minimum wage, if I could even get full-time before graduation, would take me a month to clear what I needed, and I had 10 days. I looked into a small loan and learned what an 18-year-old with no credit and no cosigner learns fast, which is that the world does not lend money to a girl whose own father won't sign. Everything I owned that had value, I owned in his house, in his name, on his land. I had a bank account with $311 in it and a future that cost more than that to hold. I was not naive. I saw every wall as I hit it. I just could not climb them fast enough, because I was 18, and the clock was cruel, and a girl with no assets and no time is not stupid. She is simply cornered. I walked home in the dark past the fields, and for the first time I let myself think the unthinkable thought. That maybe I would lose it. That maybe the letter would stay taped and useless in my drawer, a souvenir of the year I almost got out. And that night, my grandmother knocked on my door. She came in carrying 2 cups of tea, which she had never done before, and she sat on the edge of my bed as though she had done it 100 times. "You've been quiet," she said, quieter than usual, and you're already the quiet one." I told her I was fine, because that was the reflex. She handed me a cup and waited, and my grandmother had a way of waiting that made the truth easier to say than to hold. So I told her a little. About state, about the robotics lab, about the way the numbers in a bridge or a beam had always felt like the one honest language in a house full of things people didn't say. I expected her to nod politely and pat my hand. Instead, her eyes changed. They sharpened, went bright and interested, and she asked me a real question about load and stress, the kind of question you only ask if some part of you once wanted to know the answer to. We talked for an hour. She asked what the deposit was and when it was due, and I told her the date and the number without thinking, the way you tell things to someone who is really listening. She didn't offer me money. She didn't tell me it would be all right. She just took it all in. Every figure, every deadline, like a woman filing something away for later. When she stood to go, she paused at my door. "Your grandfather," she said, "believed a mind like yours was the most valuable thing a family could own. He was right about very few things. He was right about that." Then she said goodnight and left me with a cold cup of tea and a question I couldn't name. After that, I started to notice things about my grandmother I had never bothered to see. She left the house every Thursday, dressed in her good coat, and told anyone who asked that she was visiting an old friend in town. She had done this for years, and no one thought about it, because you don't examine the habits of a quiet old woman at the end of the table. But now, I was looking. And on the Thursday after our tea, I was walking back from another dead-end job application when I saw her come out of a low-brick office on 2nd Street. There was a name on the door in gold letters: Alvarez Law. She was carrying a thick envelope, cream-colored, the kind that holds documents, not letters, and she held it against her chest the way you hold something that matters. She didn't see me. I stood behind a parked truck and watched my 78-year-old grandmother, who supposedly had no money of her own and sat at the cold end of a table she didn't rule, tuck a lawyer's envelope into her handbag and walk to the bus stop with a straightness in her back. I suddenly understood I had been misreading my whole life. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't know what there was to say. But that night at dinner, I watched her differently. My father held forth about the shop, about the land, about how one day all of it, the house and the fields and the family company, would pass to coal, because that was how things were done. My grandmother cut her carrots into small, even squares and said nothing. And I thought about the envelope, and the gold letters, and the way she had held that thick cream paper against her heart. I didn't have the shape of it yet, but I knew, the way you know weather is coming, that something was. My father made it official at dinner 2 nights later, though of course nothing was official about it. It was just a man announcing a world he assumed he owned. "Cole," he said, "once you're through school, you'll come into the company. Learn it from the ground up like I did. Someday, it's all yours. The shop, the land, this house." A man builds something to hand down to his son. Cole was 15 and mostly interested in his food, but he sat up a little, the way you do when the room hands you something. And I felt it land on me too, the shape of my whole future spoken out loud by a man who had never asked me a single question about mine. Not because I'd failed, because I was a girl. My father wasn't cruel about it. That's what people never understand. He genuinely believed he was describing the natural order, the way you describe how water runs downhill. Sons build, daughters serve. Money spent on a boy is an investment. Money spent on a girl runs down the drain. He believed it the way his own father had beaten it into him, and he had never once thought to ask why, in this particular house, it was his mother's name, and not his own, on every paper that mattered. He didn't know that yet. Neither did I exactly. But I watched my grandmother, at the cold end of the table, lift her eyes to my father while he divided up a kingdom that had never been his to give, and I saw something move behind them. Patience. And underneath the patience, so faint you could miss it, the smallest edge of a thing that was almost, but not quite, a smile. She went back to her carrots, and she said nothing at all. I held it together on the outside, the way I always had, but something inside me was cracking along an old seam. I kept the peace at dinner. I carried the dishes. I said the small jokes. But at night I lay awake doing arithmetic that never came out right. 8 days now. 7. The taped letter in my drawer felt like it was ticking. And then, on the 6th day, my mother found me crying in the laundry room, quietly, into a folded towel, and instead of holding me, she sighed the sigh of a woman inconvenienced by her daughter's grief. "You're making your father miserable," she said. "You know that? He hasn't slept. All this over some school." I stared at her. "Mom, he tore up the one thing I ever— You've upset the whole house, Grace." And there it was, laid bare. Not, "Is my daughter all right?" Not, "What does she need?" But look what your wanting has cost the men in this family. My mother had spent her whole life keeping the peace too. I understood that even then. She had swallowed her own hungers so long she couldn't remember she'd ever had them, and now she was guarding the same cage she'd been locked in, because a bird who forgets it has wings will fight to keep others grounded. I loved her. That was the hard part. I loved her, and I finally saw that she was not going to save me, that no one in this house was going to save me, that the last safety net I'd been secretly counting on had never actually been there. I folded the towel. I said, "Okay, Mom." And I went upstairs and I got down on my knees and I pulled my old suitcase out from the back of the closet. I packed the suitcase that night. Not to run away. I want to be clear about that, because for years I couldn't explain it even to myself. I wasn't planning to flee in the dark like a coward. I packed it because my father had said I could find my own roof, and some cold, clear part of me had finally started to believe him, and a woman who might have to leave a room should be ready to leave it. So I packed 2 pairs of jeans, my good sweater, the physics textbook I'd bought used and never told anyone about, my acceptance letter, taped whole, in the inside pocket where it couldn't get bent, socks, underwear, the small photo of my grandfather I'd taken from the hall because no one would miss it. I packed like I was studying for a test, methodical, unhurried, folding each thing into squares the way my grandmother cut her carrots. And when it was full, I slid it under my bed, back against the wall where the shadows were, and I lay down on top of the covers and felt something I had not felt in 18 years in that house. Not hope. Hope was the tender, stupid thing that had died beside the pot roast. This was harder and cleaner than hope. It was readiness. It was the knowledge that whatever happened at the end of these 10 days, I was not going to be caught flat-footed and begging. I would have my future in a bag under my bed, taped and folded and mine, and if the moment came when I had to choose between this house and that life, I would not have to waste a single second packing. I would just pick it up and go. I didn't know yet that the moment would come at that very dinner table. I didn't know my grandmother had been packing something of her own, on Thursdays, in gold-lettered offices, for far longer than 10 days. But the suitcase was ready. And so, finally, was I. My grandmother saw the suitcase 2 days later. I hadn't meant for her to. She came into my room to return a book, and the corner of it was showing, just an edge of hard blue shell peeking out from the shadows under the bed. She looked at it for a long moment. I braced for the lecture, the guilt, the "you can't do this to your mother." It didn't come. Instead, she sat down on the edge of my bed, the way she had the night of the tea, and she was quiet for a while. And then she said something I have carried with me every day since. "Good," she said. "A woman should always be able to leave a room." I didn't know what to say. She reached down, without asking, and pushed the suitcase a little further into the shadow so it wouldn't show. Then she straightened up and looked at me with those bright, filing away eyes. "My mother couldn't leave," she said. "She stayed 40 years in a house that told her she was nothing but a pair of hands. She died in it, still believing them." She smoothed her skirt. "I made myself a promise, a long time ago, that no woman in this family would ever again be trapped in a room she couldn't walk out of. It has taken me most of my life to keep that promise, but I am close now." I asked her what she meant. She only patted my knee and stood. "You keep that bag packed, Grace," she said at the door. "But you keep your seat at that dinner table too. Just a little longer. There's something I want you to see." And she left me there, and I lay awake half the night wondering what a quiet old woman could possibly have to show me that I hadn't already lost. I made one last honest try at the front door, because that's who I still was. 4 days left. I wrote it all out first, the way I do. The whole case on a single page. The scholarship covered 90%. The deposit was $300. One time. Refundable if I withdrew. Starting salary for an engineer, right out of school, more than my father cleared in the shop in a year. I put it in front of him after supper and I said, steady and low, "Dad, I'm not asking you to pay. I'm asking you to let me. Here are the numbers. Just look at them." He looked at them. I'll give him that. He picked up my careful page and he read it, and for one breath I thought the numbers might do what my tears never could. Then he laughed. Not a cruel laugh, exactly. A dismissing one. The laugh you give a child who's built something out of blocks. "A girl engineer," he said, shaking his head, sliding the page back across the table. "You'd be the joke of every job site in the state. They'd eat you alive, honey, and then where would you be? Broke, embarrassed, and too old to marry decent." He said it like a kindness. That was the thing about my father I could never make outsiders understand. He wasn't twisting a knife. In his own mind, he was pulling me back from a cliff. And that was somehow worse, because you can't argue a man out of a cruelty he mistakes for love. I took my page back. I folded it in half. I said, "Okay, Dad." And I went upstairs and added the page to the suitcase, and I understood that I had knocked on the last door, and it too was made of stone. 2 days left. I sat on my bed with the phone I'd bought a calling card for, and I dialed the number for the university's admissions office, because I had decided I would rather withdraw with dignity than let the seat expire in silence. I would tell them I couldn't confirm. I would ask, in the smallest voice, whether there was any way to hold it a little longer, though I already knew the answer. My hands were cold. I got as far as the automated menu, press 1 for admissions, and I sat there with my thumb over the button, listening to the little tune they play while they decide whether your future is worth another minute on hold. And I thought about my grandmother. "Keep your seat at that table just a little longer. There's something I want you to see." I didn't know why I trusted it. Everyone else in that house had failed me, one after another. My father with his tearing hands and my mother with her guarding silence, and my brother who was 15 and already learning that I was less than him. Why would the quietest one, the one at the cold end of the table, be any different? But I hung up the phone. I don't fully know why. Something in the way she'd said it, filing away my deadline, my numbers, the exact shape of my need. Something in that thick cream envelope held against her heart. I put the phone down and I did not withdraw. I decided to give her one dinner, one more meal at that table before I picked up my bag and walked out of that house for good. It was, without question, the most important decision I have ever made in my life. And I almost didn't make it. That same night, my grandmother came to my room and closed the door behind her, which she had never done. She sat down in my desk chair, turned it to face me, and folded her hands. "It's time you understood something about this house," she said. "And I'm only going to say it once, so listen." I listened. "Your grandfather," she said, "was a hard man, in most ways no better than your father. But he was not a fool about money, and he trusted no one, least of all his own son. When he died, 20 years ago, he did not leave this house to Roy. He did not leave the land to Roy. He did not leave the company to Roy." She let that sit. "He left all of it to me. Every acre. Every share. The deed to this house has one name on it, and it has never been your father's. It has been mine, for 20 years. I couldn't speak. All my life I had watched my father sit at the head of that table and carve up an empire, hand the house to Cole, tear up my future, order us all around a kingdom he ruled by voice alone. But he acts like he owns everything, I finally said. Dad decides everything. Yes, my grandmother said, and there was something terrible and patient in the way she said it. He does act like it. I have let him act like it for 20 years, because it cost me nothing and it kept the peace, and because I was waiting to see what kind of man he'd become when he thought no one could stop him. She looked at me. Now I know, and I've seen enough. Down the hall, I could hear my father laughing at something on the television, comfortable, certain, the master of a house that had never for one day belonged to him. And I finally understood why my grandmother had always chosen the cold end of the table. She had never needed the head. She had owned the whole room the entire time. Why now? I asked her. Why tell me now? My grandmother was quiet for a moment, choosing her words the way she chose everything, carefully, with no waste. Because for 20 years I have been watching this family to see who would build something real, she said. Not who would take, not who would shout the loudest or claim the head of the table, who would make something out of nothing and treat people right while they did it. I owed that much to your grandfather's money. I wasn't going to hand it to whoever happened to be born a boy. She looked at me steadily. I watched your father spend 20 years running a company he thinks he owns into the same ground his own father used to. I watched him raise your brother to expect the world and raise you to apologize for wanting any of it. Her jaw tightened, just slightly. And I watched an 18-year-old girl teach herself engineering at a library table, win a scholarship no one helped her get, and then say sorry for ruining dinner while her father tore it in half. I felt tears come, and I let them. Because for once, they weren't the crying of a girl begging to be seen. They were something else. I'm not doing this to be kind, Grace, she said, and her voice went flat and certain. Understand that. Kindness would be easy and it would be wrong. I'm doing this because it's right, and because after 78 years I have finally found the person in this family who actually deserves it. You just happen to be that person. She stood. Get some sleep. Tomorrow at dinner, you sit at that table and you keep your bag packed, and you let me do the talking. All of it, do you understand? I said yes. It was the truest yes of my life. Before she left, she took the cream envelope out of her handbag and set it on my desk. Alvarez Law, the return address read, in the same gold as the door on 2nd Street. I've spent the last 3 months with a lawyer named Ruth Alvarez, she said. A good one. Careful. We've built something that can't be torn up at a dinner table. She didn't open it. She just let me see the weight of it. And I want to tell you what I felt in that moment, because it surprised me. It was not relief. It was not even joy. It was, of all things, a kind of shame, quickly followed by something clearer. Because I realized, sitting there, that some part of me had still been waiting to be rescued. Waiting for my father to relent, or my mother to soften, or now for my grandmother to swoop in and hand me my future wrapped in cream paper. And I understood, all at once, that a future handed to me was not the same as a future I had earned, and that I did not want to trade one kind of dependence for another. Grandma, I said, and my voice was steadier than it had ever been at that table. I don't want to be given anything. I taught myself. I won it myself. I just need a door I can walk through on my own 2 feet. That's all I've ever needed. My grandmother looked at me for a long, long moment. And then she smiled, fully, the first full smile I had ever seen on her face, and she said, That right there is the answer I have been waiting 18 years to hear you say. I didn't understand it yet. I would, the next night, at the table. I barely slept. I lay awake turning her words over, and slowly the real shape of my whole life came clear to me in the dark. All these years I had thought the thing I wanted was the scholarship, the lab, the degree, the escape. Those were real, and I wanted them. But under the want was something older and more wounded, and my grandmother had put her finger right on it. I had wanted my father to be proud of me. That was the door I'd been knocking on since I was small enough to reach the handle. Every dish I carried, every silence I smoothed, every apology for taking up space, all of it had been one long knock on a door I was terrified to admit was never going to open. And here was the thing I finally understood, lying in the dark that night. The scholarship was never going to open it either. If I had walked into that dinner with a Nobel Prize, my father would have found a way to tear it in half, because the problem was never my worth. The problem was that he had decided, before I was even born, that a girl's worth was not a thing that counted. I could spend my whole life trying to earn a seat at a table whose owner had already decided I didn't get one. Or I could stop knocking, pick up my bag, and walk out of the house entirely into a world that would weigh me by what I built. I chose. Lying there in the dark, I chose, before my grandmother ever slid a single thing across that table. Whatever happened at dinner, I was done begging to be seen by a man who had made himself blind on purpose. That choice was mine. It was the only one that ever mattered. In the morning, my grandmother found me in the kitchen before the others were up. "Tonight," she said simply, pouring her tea. "At dinner. It ends tonight." I asked her if she was sure. I asked it because I loved her, and because I knew that once she did this, whatever this was, there would be no putting the family back the way it had been. My father would never forgive it. The house would never be quiet in the old way again. "Grandma," I said, "you don't have to do this for me. I've decided to go either way. I'll leave tonight if I have to, bag and all. You don't have to blow up your whole family." She set down the teapot and looked at me, and her eyes were calm as still water. "Child," she said, "I'm not doing it for you. I told you that. I'm doing it because it's right, and because a promise I made 40 years ago is finally coming due." She buttoned the top button of her good coat, though she wasn't going anywhere, and I would learn that this was her tell, the thing she did when she had made a decision she would not unmake. "Tonight," she said, "I am going to say one short thing to your father that he will not believe. And when he laughs, because he will laugh, I am going to slide one thing across that table, and he is going to stop laughing." She smiled that small, terrible, patient smile. "You just sit there, Grace. Sit at the table with your bag ready by the stairs and watch. And when it's done, you're going to have a choice to make. A real one. And I want you to make it with your own 2 feet. Exactly the way you told me you wanted to." She finished her tea. She rinsed the cup, and she set it in the rack, precisely, the way she set down her fork. The day crawled. I moved through it in a strange calm, the calm of a person who has already decided and is only waiting for the world to catch up. I brought my suitcase downstairs when no one was looking and set it by the bottom of the stairs, tucked behind the coat rack, ready. My father came home from the shop loud and easy, king of his little kingdom, complaining about a supplier, certain of every inch of ground beneath his feet. At one point he clapped Cole on the shoulder and said, "This one'll run the place someday, won't you, son?" And Cole grinned, and then Cole looked at me across the room and said, not even cruelly, just repeating what he'd been taught, "You could keep the books, Gracie. Girls are good at neat handwriting." He was 15. He didn't know he was quoting a whole machine that had been running for generations. That was the thing I understood by then, watching my little brother parrot my father parrot his father. My dad wasn't a monster who'd invented this. He was a man standing on a conveyor belt he couldn't see, handing down to his son the same small, poisoned inheritance that had been handed to him. It didn't excuse him. Nothing excused the torn letter. But it let me stop hating him quite so much, which turned out to be its own kind of freedom. My mother set the table for 5, the way she always did, and never once thought to wonder why, in all these years, it was Meg who paid the property tax bill that came every autumn in her name alone. Nobody wondered. That was how it had worked for 20 years, and in a few hours, it was going to stop working forever. We sat down to dinner at 6, all 5 of us, in our usual places. My father at the head, my mother to his right, Cole across, me wherever, and my grandmother at the cold end, by the window, spine straight, hands folded, waiting. My father was in fine form. He carved the chicken and held forth, And about halfway through the meal, he found his way, as he always did, to the subject of me. "Grace here's been sulking about her little college fantasy," he said to the table, spearing a potato. "She'll get over it. Give her a year, she'll be thanking me." He pointed his fork at me. Genial, sure. "You'll see, honey. This is me doing you a favor." And at the far end of the table, my grandmother set down her fork. She did it the way she had 2 weeks before. Slowly, precisely, in the exact center of her plate. Then she folded her napkin. And she stood up. My father stopped chewing. My grandmother reached for her good coat, which was hanging on the back of her chair, and she put it on, there at the table, and she buttoned it to the top, one button at a time, in a silence that swallowed the whole room. Then she looked down the length of that table at her son, and she said, in a voice as steady and cold as well water, "Go pack, Roy. She starts in the fall." For a second, nobody breathed. And then my father laughed. He actually laughed, a big surprised bark of it, and he leaned back in his chair at the head of his table. "Go pack?" he said. "This is my house, Mother, my land, my company. You want to send her to school? You go right ahead and pay for it out of your Social Security. But don't you come to my table and tell me to pack." My grandmother did not laugh. She reached into the pocket of her buttoned coat, and she took out a single folded document, and she slid it across the table. It slid the whole length of that long wooden table, spinning slightly, and came to rest against my father's plate. Nobody moved to touch it. My father looked at it the way you look at a snake that might not be dead. "What's this?" he said. And it wasn't really a question, more a warning, the voice of a man who has felt the ground shift and is pretending he hasn't. "Open it," my grandmother said. He didn't want to. I watched him, not want to. Watched the certainty drain out of his shoulders even before his hands moved. Then he flipped it open, and I saw his eyes go to the top of the page and stop, and go back to the top again, as if he could read it into saying something else. It was the deed to the house. I could see it from where I sat, the heavy paper, the county seal, the recorded stamp. And at the top, in the space for the name of the owner, it did not say Roy Hartwell. It said Margaret Hartwell. Only that. One name. His mother's. "This is old," my father said, and his voice had gone strange, thin. "This is from before Dad died. He left the house to—" "He left it to me," my grandmother said. "All of it. 20 years ago. The house you sleep in, the land your shop sits on, the company whose checks you sign." She was still standing, still buttoned, still calm. "You have run it, Roy. You have lived here, and shouted here, and torn up your daughter's future at this very table, but you have never owned a single board foot of it. Not once. Not for one day." My mother's hand had come up to her mouth. Cole was staring at my father as if the man had changed shape in front of him, and my father, the king of the head of the table, sat holding a deed with his mother's name on it, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched him have nothing at all to say. He found his voice eventually. Men like my father always do. "You can't just—" he started, and my grandmother cut him off, not by raising her voice but by lowering it, which is a far more frightening thing. "You never owned any of it, Roy," she said. "You only sat at the head of the table." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples went out and out. He stood up so fast his chair scraped and nearly toppled. "This is my life," he said. And now he was loud. Now the voice that had ruled that house for 20 years was cracking at the edges. "I built this company. I ran this land. You sat in a chair by the window for 20 years and let me. You can't take it now. You can't do this." "I'm not taking anything," my grandmother said. "It was never yours to take from. But I will tell you what I have done." She reached into her coat again and set the cream envelope from Alvarez Law on the table, unhurried. 3 months ago, I placed all of it into a trust. The house, the land, the shares, every dollar. It is done, it is signed, and it is beyond the reach of anyone at this table, including me. She looked at him. And here is the one moment I will give my father, the near mercy of it. Because it was real. For just a second under the fury, I saw a small lost boy in his face, a boy who had spent his whole life certain of a throne, being told by his mother that the throne had always been a borrowed chair. "Why?" he said, and it came out cracked. "Why would you do this to me?" "I didn't do it to you," she said, gently, the only gentle thing she said all night. "I did it because it was right. You spent 20 years showing me exactly what kind of man holds power when he thinks no one can take it back." She let that sit. "And you tore up the future of the one person in this family who deserved to be trusted with any of it. So I made sure it went where it belonged." Then my grandmother turned, at last, to me. The whole table turned with her. My father, my mother, my brother, all of them looking at me now, the quiet one, the one who carried the dishes, and I could feel what they were waiting for. They were waiting for me to win, to take it, to sit down in the chair at the head of the table that had just been pulled out from under my father and rule the house that had ruled me. My grandmother slid the cream envelope a few inches toward me. "It can all come to you," she said quietly. "The house, the land, everything. You could stay right here, Grace, and let your father find out what it feels like to live under someone else's roof, at someone else's table." And I felt it. I won't lie to you. I felt the pull of it. The sweet, hot, human pull of turning the whole thing around and making him small the way he'd made me small. For one long breath I wanted it more than I had ever wanted anything. And then I stood up. Calm. The way I'd decided in the dark 2 nights before. "No," I said. And I looked at my grandmother, not my father, because she was the one who understood. "I don't want the house. I don't want to sit at the head of this table. I don't want to spend one more day of my life in a room that measures me against these people." I took a breath. "I just want what you set aside for school. And I want to walk out of here on my own 2 feet the way I earned. That's all I ever wanted." Because I had finally learned the thing that took me 18 years. I stopped knocking on a door that was never going to open. And the freedom of that, the clean, quiet freedom of simply stopping, was worth more than any deed, any house, any throne. My grandmother's eyes shone. "Ruth set aside a fund for your education," she said. "In your name. Nobody can touch it but you." She nodded once. "The rest stays in the trust. Exactly as you asked." And I understood that I had just passed a test I hadn't known I was taking my whole life. I turned to my father then. He was still standing, deflated, the deed in one hand and the trust papers he couldn't fight in the other. And for the first time in my life, he had to look up at me instead of down. I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised me most of all. I looked at the man who had torn my future in half between bites of pot roast, and I found that the thing I felt was not hatred and not triumph. It was something closer to pity. And under the pity, a boundary as clear and hard as the county seal on that deed. "You didn't tear up my future, Dad," I said. My voice was very quiet. I did not need it to be anything else. "You tore up a piece of paper. And then you showed me the one thing I never understood until tonight. That my future was never in your hands to begin with." He opened his mouth. Nothing came. "I spent 18 years trying to make you proud of me," I said. "I'm done. Not because I stopped caring. Because I finally understood you were never going to be, and that it was never about anything I did or didn't do. It was decided before I was born." I picked up my plate, out of pure habit, and then I set it back down, and I left it there, because carrying the dishes was not my job anymore. "I hope someday you figure out what that cost you," I said. "I really do." And then I walked to the bottom of the stairs, and I reached behind the coat rack, and I picked up the blue suitcase that had been sitting there packed and ready for 11 days. My mother made a sound then, a small broken sound, the sound of a woman waking up too late in a cage she'd helped to lock. "Grace," she said. Just my name. The way I'd once said hers. I looked at her, and I felt the old pull to smooth it, to fix it. to say sorry. And I didn't. I just said, "Goodbye, Mom." And I meant it kindly. And I meant it for good. My grandmother walked me to the door. In the front hall, under the coats that hung left to right by height, she stopped me with a hand on my arm, and she reached up and buttoned the top button of my jacket, the way she had buttoned her own coat at the table an hour before. Her hands were steady. Mine, I realized, had finally stopped shaking. "There," she said, smoothing my collar. "Now you're ready to leave the room." I started to cry then, but they were not the old tears, the begging tears. "Come with me," I said. "You don't have to stay here with them." She shook her head gently. "This is still my house," she said. "I'll decide what happens under this roof now, and I intend to enjoy it." And there it was, the smallest flash of that terrible patient humor she'd been hiding at the cold end of the table for 20 years. "You go build your bridges, Grace. Call me on Sundays. Tell me about your load and your stress." She put her hand on my cheek. "A mind like yours," she said, "is the most valuable thing this family will ever own. Your grandfather knew it. Now you know it too." I hugged her, hard, the way I had never been allowed to hug anyone in that house, and she held me back with a strength that surprised me. Then she opened the door. The evening was cool and blue outside, the fields going gold at the edges, the whole wide world sitting there waiting like a question I finally knew how to answer. I picked up my suitcase. I stepped over the threshold, and behind me, for the first time in 18 years, I did not turn around to check whether anyone had noticed I was gone. I started in the fall, exactly the way my grandmother said I would. I confirmed my scholarship 2 days before it expired, with a deposit paid out of the education fund Ruth Alvarez had set up in my name, and I rode a bus 300 miles with one blue suitcase and a taped-together acceptance letter in the inside pocket. The dorm was small and loud and full of people who had no idea I had ever been the quiet one at the cold end of a table. In the robotics lab, for the first time in my life, nobody asked me to keep the books or carry the dishes or apologize for wanting to understand how things held together. They just handed me the work, and I was good at it. My father did not lose his empire, because it turned out he never had one. He kept living in the house on Miller Road, because my grandmother let him stay, on her terms now, under her roof, at her table. I'm told he sits at the head of it still, out of habit, and that everyone at that table knows now exactly what the head of the table is worth. My mother and I speak sometimes, carefully, across the distance. Cole, to his credit, called me once, junior year, to ask what engineering was really like. I told him, every word. And I called my grandmother every Sunday, exactly as promised, and told her about my load and my stress. And she listened the way she had always listened, filing it all away, a woman who had finally seen a room arranged the way she'd wanted it for 40 years. I am an engineer now. I build bridges, which my grandmother finds very funny, because she says I spent 18 years being one for a family that couldn't cross to save its life. She is 91 and still sits at the cold end of the table, still owns every board foot of that house, and still runs the family company through a manager she trusts, having quietly, over the years, brought me in to help redraw the things my father let fall down. The world has not changed. Somewhere tonight, some man at some table is deciding that his daughter's dreams are money down the drain, and no deed of mine will stop him. That machine is older than my grandfather, and it will outlive me, but it does not run through me anymore. My grandmother reached back across 40 years and broke one link of it, for one girl, and that girl is teaching the ones coming up behind her that their worth was never a thing anyone at any table got to tear in half. It is not the whole war. It is one link. But you break the chain, one link at a time, or you do not break it at all. It turned out my worth was never something my father could tear up, because it was never in his hands to begin with, and the day I stopped waiting for him to hand it to me was the day I finally picked it up myself.